I'm a Penguin Random House author and book coach. Over the past 18 years, I've worked with nearly 1,000 writers. Most of these writers used flashbacks in a way that made their story worse. The problem isn't that you can't use flashbacks, it's that most people use them in the wrong way. Here's the real problem. So many writers are imitating the way that flashbacks work in the movies, and that is a recipe for disaster. In this video, I'm going to talk about why a flashback works differently in a book than it does in a movie, how to get into flashbacks so you don't confuse your reader, and I'm going to give you some examples from published books of how to use flashbacks in the right way. Ready for everything you wanted to know about flashbacks but were afraid to ask? Let's get into this. So let's start by taking a look at a short clip from the film Casablanca. Now, how does the filmmaker get into this flashback? Rick takes a puff off his cigarette and begins to remember. And then we have a slow dissolve to Paris, to memories of when he first met Ilsa. Works, right? Sure, for a movie. But try this same technique for your book, and you're going to get your story off track. Why? Well, let me show you some problem sentences, the kind that my clients often turn in. Suddenly, I remembered being 6 years old. I began to recall the time in the past when the kids had been cruel to me. My mind flashed back to the day I was fired. If you've ever set up your flashback like any of those examples, you're already creating structural problems for yourself. In a movie, a flashback often works as something a character is remembering. But in a memoir or novel, a flashback works differently. It's usually not what your character or narrator is actually remembering. So you don't need to say, as I walk through the forest with my mother, I begin to recall the first time I walked through the forest as a little girl. So what do you do instead? Let me show you what actually works and see if you can spot the difference between this example and the earlier remembering example I gave you. I walked through the forest with my mother, feeling strangely comforted. Even as a little girl, walking through the forest for the first time, the trees soothed me. So, what is the difference between these two examples? And most importantly, why does it matter? Well, in a book, you never need for your narrator or your character to remember something. Why not? Well, for one thing, the tools that a filmmaker uses are different than the tools that you use as a writer. And a lot of filmmakers' tools just aren't available in a book. So take a look at exactly how we go from the main story to the flashback in the movie Ratatouille. The food critic Anton Ego takes a bite of ratatouille and the camera zooms in on his face. The screen dissolves, the colors shift from cold to warm. And suddenly he's a little boy sitting at his mother's kitchen table. The filmmaker has an entire toolkit to take you from the present into the past. You have camera effects, dissolves, color changes, music, a younger actor, because film is a visual medium. A filmmaker's tools are images. As a book writer, you have none of these tools. What do you have? Words on a page. So if you're thinking of flashbacks in the way that movies use them, as something that your character remembers, well, you're thinking with the wrong toolkit. How does a flashback work in a book? Basically, it's an aside. You're telling your main story, something happens, and you pause to say, By the way, here's a story from my past that's related to what just happened. So this is actually much, much easier. And perhaps more importantly, you don't run the risk of sounding insincere. And all of a sudden, I am transported back to age 11. It's just not that believable. So you don't have to do this. Instead, what you need to do to get into a flashback is this. Basically, you need to make a point. Okay, so to write a flashback into your book, you need two things. First of all, something must happen in your main storyline. And second, you need to make a point about what just happened that gets you into the flashback. Now, this actually sounds way harder to do than it is in reality. So let me give you a couple of examples from published memoirs that show you exactly how easy this is to pull off. Okay, so this first example is from Where You End and I Begin by Lee McLaren. So let me give you just a little bit of context here. Lee is the narrator. Her dog just found her hamster in the snow. And Lee's mother is the first one speaking. "Oh, Lee, I don't think he's going to make it. The best thing to do would be to put him out of his misery." "What? No." "Maybe you should call your father." "I'd once watched my dad place an injured sparrow behind the tire of his Celica in reverse. He was gentle with animals, but he'd worked weekends at a funeral home in high school and wasn't squeamish about death. He said it was cruel to let an animal suffer. Adrian was suffering. I could see that. There must be something we can do." My mind raced. So we get a very short flashback there. So let's analyze exactly how the author does this. Remember our two rules. What is the first one? Something must happen. So what happens here? Well, Lee's mother suggests calling her father. Something happened. So what is the second rule? We need to make a point related to what just happened. The point that will get us into the flashback. So what is that point here? I'd once watched my dad place an injured sparrow behind the tire of his Celica and reverse. Now, why is making a point so important? Well, it is what's giving your flashback a reason to exist. The point is what makes your flashback relevant to the story you're telling. So instead of saying, "As my mother is talking, I recall the time my father placed an injured sparrow behind the wheel of his Celica," the author just makes a point. Okay, I can already hear what you're thinking. But what's the difference, Wendy? Why is making a point any better? Don't they accomplish the very same thing? Don't they both get us into the flashback? If you're confusing flashbacks with moments you actually remembered, you're really limited. So now you can only jump back in time when in your real life you were actually remembering an earlier moment in time. But doing that simply isn't necessary. You don't need to rely solely on things you remembered when you want to go back into the past. You can jump back to a scene from the past simply by making a point, by making that scene, that flashback, relevant to your story. Now, the second reason this is important, whether you're writing a novel or a memoir, is because of sincerity. You're having this very sad moment. Your hamster is on the verge of death. In this moment, are you going to pause to remember an earlier moment? It just doesn't feel believable. So what do? Make a point instead. A point that makes your flashback relevant to what just happened in your main story. I'm going to give you one more example just so that you really grasp this concept. Before I do, be sure to sign up for your free 7-part class on how to structure your memoir. Check out the information in the description. You'll also find information on how to get one-on-one coaching on your book from me and my team. Okay, so this example is from Wild. Let me get right into it, and then we can analyze what exactly Cheryl Strait is doing. The doctor shook his head sadly and pressed on. He had a job to do. They could try to ease the pain in her back with radiation, he offered. Radiation might reduce the size of the tumors that were growing along the entire length of her spine. I did not cry. I only breathed, horribly, intentionally, and then forgot to breathe. I'd fainted once, furious, age 3, holding my breath because I didn't want to get out of the bathtub. Too young to remember it myself. What did you do? What did you do? I'd ask my mother all through my childhood, making her tell me the story again and again, amazed and delighted by my own impetuous will. She'd held out her hands and watched me turn blue, my mother had always told me. She'd waited me out until my hands fell into her palms and I took a breath and came back to life. Breathe. Can I ride my horse? My mother asked the real doctor. She sat with her hands folded tightly together and her ankles hooked one to the other. So what happens in the main timeline? Cheryl forgets to breathe. And what's the point that gets us into the flashback? I'd fainted once, furious, age 3, holding my breath because I didn't want to get out of the bathtub. So there is a way that you can get this wrong, and that is to put the point you're making at the end of your flashback. This is yet another reason to stay away from phrases such as I remember or I flash back to. I see writers do this all the time. They get into a scene by recalling something that happened when they were 6 years old. And then they finally get to the point at the end of the flashback. Now, what's the problem with this? So when you go back in time, your reader is constantly asking themselves, well, what just happened? What does this have to do with the main story? Put the point you're making at the beginning of the flashback and you won't have this problem. So if you want to know more about how to jump around in time in your book, or maybe you just want to learn the principles for using flashbacks in the right way, watch this video next.